Hello, and welcome to the first episode of the new and improved podcast, League, Lore, and More. Formerly known as Slightly Toxic and Very Tilted, the name's being changed to greater reflect the content being produced. The focus of the podcast is to provide listeners with a look into the world of Runeterra as created by Riot Games. Join me for our first series, which will begin in just a moment, regarding the ancient Shuriman civilization. Over the next several weeks, we will go through each champion that calls the Great Desert home and do our best to compare these characters and places to things we already know and love. If you do enjoy the content, please download, like, share, and whatever other method you might have to show your support for the podcast. You can find these podcasts uploaded to YouTube at my channel, Funky Odor. You can find me on Twitter at OdorFunky, and if you want to absorb more League of Legends content, please check out my stream on twitch.tv/thatfunkyodor. Thank you all for the support and enjoy.
Challenge Shurima. Challenge fate.
As mentioned in the intro, today and for the next few weeks, we'll be doing a headfirst dive into Shurima as our focus of study. This means that champions like Azir, Sivir, Xerath, Nasus, and others will have their own featured episodes all about their lore and their story. Today, we'll be discussing the region itself and trying to make sense of its place in Runeterra. The Empire of Shurima was once a thriving civilization that spanned an entire continent. Forged in a bygone age by the mighty god warriors of the Ascended Host, it united all the disparate peoples of the south and enforced a lasting peace between them. Few dared to rebel. Those that did, like the accursed nation of Acathia, were crushed without mercy. However, after several thousand years of growth and prosperity, the failed ascension of Shurima's last emperor left the capital in ruins, and tales of the empire's former glory became little more than myth. Now, most of the nomadic inhabitants of Shurima's desert eke out a meager existence from the unforgiving land. Some have built small outposts to defend the few oases, while others delve into long-lost catacombs in search of the untold riches that must surely lie buried there. There are also those who live as mercenaries, taking coin for their service before disappearing back into the lawless wastelands. Still, a handful dare to dream of a return to the old ways. Indeed, more recently, the tribes have been stirred by whispers from the heart of the desert that their emperor Azir has returned to lead them into a new, wondrous age. Though the empire's first capital was Narimazeth, far to the west, a second, much larger city was raised above the legendary Oasis of the Dawn, where the great rivers of Shurima converged. For countless generations, the Shuriman emperors ruled from this seat of power. With each new conquest or alliance, the empire grew, and older nations such as Ixtal, Kalduga, Targon, and Faraj were welcomed into the fold. However, when the noble emperor Azir was denied ascension, all Shurima's hopes died with him. The royal line was broken, rivers ran dry, leaving the land barren and desolate, and the sun disk sank beneath the sands. The remaining Ascended could not agree on how to preserve the Empire's legacy, eventually fighting among themselves in a war that ravaged most of the known world. So, it seems like Shurima shares a lot of similarities with pretty much any empire in the known world. If you want another like fake example, Shurima would kind of seem to be like the lost city of Atlantis, as far as like the mystery around it and kind of just sinking away into nothingness and becoming a myth, which it is, but not for some people. And then for a real life example, in the real world, for a literal comparison, any other great empire really works, but you could use something like the Romans are a good example to relate to, as well as ancient Egypt. Their empire, the Romans, was covering vast expanse of the known world, and few dared to rebel against them for hundreds of years. Achathia rebelled against Shurima, just like the Jewish people did to Rome in the year 66 CE or 80, depending on what time of or what time system you use. They're both the same year, and both got crushed. Rome was destroyed by prolonged years of poor emperors, poor rulers making poor decisions that led to peoples like the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, and the Vandals and other groups invading Rome and eventually causing the collapse of the empire. The state of Rome appeared weak to these groups and invited challenges. Rome was weak, but they were most likely hiding what they could for a long time before the House of Cards got blown over. It's like when an animal is attacking you and you are supposed to make yourself look as big as you can. You aren't actually that big, but the perception dissuades the attacker from commencing. That was probably what was going on with Rome for a couple hundred years, especially in the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire of Rome. The barbarians, as they were called, probably perceived Rome to be stronger, and that probably is what dissuaded them from attacking them. And then, even though Rome was probably weak enough to be taken earlier than what it was, and so the perception of strength can be sometimes better than actual strength. This isn't comparable in that sense to Shurima. They weren't conquered, but the idea that poor leadership and poor rulers play a major role in the strength and the prosperity of a civilization is present in both. Shurima's emperor Azir and the desert locale of Shurima make for a great comparison to the ancient Egyptians, which is probably what the civilization is based off. This massive sun disk structure in the center of the capital, where the people seeking ascension to godlike beings performed the rituals to become ascended, is comparable to ancient pyramids and temples. The pyramids were mostly for burial purposes, I know, but great structures that seem impossible to have been built when they were are present in both societies. What happened to Egypt after it no longer had pharaohs and strong leadership / hope in the hearts of its people is that it became a box to check on every other empire's conquests. It's for like another history lesson, I guess. If ever since basically the Romans, and probably even before that with the Persians, although I'm not entirely certain on them, but ever since Egypt stopped being this world power that was conquering people, which happened thousands of years ago, it turned into basically this myth of this great land that, okay, it has these pyramids, the Sphinx, all this stuff that's awesome, but they're not doing anything with that awesomeness anymore. They're kind of just there. It became basically like if you were a great world empire, it's like, oh, you had to conquer Egypt. Napoleon did it. I mean, why would France really need to go and conquer Egypt? His troops fired cannons and hit the Sphinx, and that's why the nose is no longer there. The Romans did it. The Middle Eastern powers did it later on. So yeah, it just kind of became like a prerequisite to anyone considering you like a great empire, which is just a weird thing that. Now, granted, they probably thought that there were riches and other treasures that were there that they would conquer and then go find in the pyramids or something. But I think that if people on Earth were blindfolded and transported to Shurima, they would think they were in ancient Egypt. And that could also be that people in the West associate anything sandy with tall structures the color of sand to be Egypt. Even though there's many other places that actually have the same type of imagery. Shurima isn't exactly like this, and Egypt isn't all sand. Obviously, they have rivers and trees and plants and stuff. It's not just a barren desert. And that's actually the way Shurima was too before their Emperor Azir failed his ascension, and then Shurima collapsed. His failure to ascend caused the royal line of Shurima to fail, and the power that it held faded away from the land. The crops stopped growing, rivers stopped flowing, and people lost all hope. And over time, it disappeared into nothingness. Kind of similar to what the people would have thought back in like ancient Egypt or even ancient China with the divine right of kings, divine right to rule is what they would tell the people that they had. And so whenever there was a natural disaster, like a flood, earthquake, great fire, something like that, it meant that you no longer had the divine right from God or gods to rule anymore. So it was kind of like a double-edged sword where it's like, oh, I'm chosen by God to rule, but then it's like, oh, okay, but when God does these other things that we don't have a natural explanation for, which obviously we know now that like that stuff just happens due to other circumstances, that it kind of doomed their dynasties and their ruling periods. Now I wanted to mention for a few minutes the ascended beings that we've been kind of dancing around and mentioning. And these you could think of as like Roman generals even that were kind of thought to be not gods and not divine, but just greater humans than the peons and the poor living in Rome and in the empire, just capable of great feats that nobody else seemed to be able to do. So like when Julius Caesar was, before he was emperor, I mean even during when he was emperor, when he was a general in Gaul and conquering everything in Western Europe, or the Roman general Cassius or Pompey or Mark Antony, Sun Tzu in China, tons of the pharaohs, just name any one of them in Egypt. The Ascended were mighty heroes, peerless tacticians, and cunning sorcerers chosen to lead the armies of Shurima in battle. It was said that entire campaigns could be won the moment a god warrior took to the field because their foes chose to turn and flee rather than face them directly. So, yeah, basically they're like angels, is a good way of putting it. Or if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, they're like the Maiar and the Valar from Valinor in the Undying Lands. They're just beings of great power. They get this power when they perform an ascension ritual at the Sun Disk, which is this great big structure, and it's a disc shape, and it's called the Sun Disk. If you play League of Legends, obviously, and you play with an Azir, his passive ability is to throw up like a tower that looks like the Sun Disk that you would see in Shurima if you were to go there. I believe Aatrox is a god warrior through this ascension process. And so he would probably be getting an episode here in a few weeks regarding his story, his relationship with Shurima, and then what his journey looked like when he stopped being an ascended god warrior and became the Darkin that he is in League as a champion. The champions in League of Legends that are listed as being involved with or from Shurima, in addition to Aatrox, even though he isn't actually listed on the website, their universe website, as being a part of this, are Azir, Amumu, Nasus, Rammus, Renekton, Rengar, Sivir, Skarner, Taliyah, and Xerath. And then I'll double check on Aatrox. I know he is, and then I will include him also in this series. Each of these champions will have their own story, their own background, their own relationships, and their own purpose. Those will be saved for another time. Their own podcast will be devoted to them. But the last thing for today's podcast is a more robust experience of Shurima that gives more life to the society and the people than what I can do just by speaking my own thoughts about it and rambling. So now I'm going to read a story written by Graham McNeil and is found in the League of Legends Realms of Runeterra official companion book titled Water and Shade to You. For the first time Kari could remember, flowers grew on the street leading from the town square to the cut. To the people of Saikal, this street was known as the Path of Dust, though Kari's Bibi said it used to be called the Water Road in the olden past. Not in her time, not even in her own Bibi's time, but a long time before that. To a girl of 8 summers like Kari, that might as well have been in the time when the great weaver spun the world into life. The bowl she carried was fashioned from clay, with an ugly crack that snaked its way around its edges, and which had been crudely repaired with hardened blobs of resin glue. Its sides were painted cornflower blue, with an enameled sun disk at its base, and when it was filled with gritty water from the cavern wells, the ripples on the surface made it look like the sun was dancing. But now the river was back, and the cut was no longer a dry, sun-baked gouge in the rock that curled around their town. Water flowed along it, and it wasn't the hard, gritty water from the wells. It was clear as blown glass, and didn't make you want to spit as soon as you took a mouthful. At night, when the old men gathered around their pipes, they whispered that it was the Hawk Father who had brought the waters back when he lifted his city up from beneath the sands. They spoke of pilgrims flocking to that golden city, but from their furrowed brows and the tone of their voices as they shooed her away, Kari wasn't sure if they thought that was a good thing or not. Kari paused to smell one of the flowers, a conical bloom with long oval petals the color of milk and honey. Bibi called it a star bloom, and, like the water, said it hadn't been seen in these parts since she was a girl of Kari's age. She loved its rich, musky smell, but the spicy pollen suddenly made her want to sneeze. She closed her eyes and tried to hold it in, first turning her head to sunrise, and then to sunset. Bibi said it was bad luck to sneeze before midday, and she was the oldest person Kari knew, so there wasn't anything she didn't know. The urge to sneeze passed, and Kari opened her eyes in time to see Maza Isa limp from her home of sun-baked brick with a handful of green leaf rushes to spread up before its entrance. It was too late to get away without her seeing Kari. The old woman was the town gossip, and when Maza Isa decided to talk to you, it would be sundown before you got away. But at least you'd know everyone in the town's comings and goings. Water and shade to you, Kari, called Maza Isa. Is Anhe's child born to the sun yet? Not yet, Maza Isa, said Kari, holding up the bowl. Bibi sent me to fetch clean water. Isa nodded and pointed to the cut. Be sure to get it cold and fresh from the river, child. New life oughtn't greet the sun bathed in dirty well water. Yes, Maza Isa, said Kari, grateful for this chance to get away. She continued on, skipping down the road and taking the winding path from the edge of town. In truth, she'd been pleased to be given away to escape Enhe's birthing screams, and she had gladly taken Bibi's cracked bowl to the river. It still felt odd saying that. River. There hadn't been a river flowing past Saikal for many generations, at least nothing beyond the few weeks in cloud season when it rained over the summits of the soaring mountains to the south. Rainwater poured down the cut in powerfully brief torrents, but it never lasted. And then Saikal's people were back to relying on water from the cave wells that tasted like biting on metal. Back when the rivers had dried up, Saikal's inhabitants had stubbornly refused to leave and follow the remaining waters. Those ancient settlers had chosen to remain in the mountains, but no one now remembered why they decided to stay. Kari left the edge of the town and the rock upon which it was built. Winding down the switchback path to the river, once it had been paved with smooth glass mosaic tiles like a river itself, but now only a handful of faded blue chips remained. Beyond the shade of town, the sun was a searing golden disk, now almost at its zenith, and Kari looked forward to reaching the cooler riverbank. From here, the river was a wonderful silver ribbon that tumbled down the mountainside, clear and cold, and tasting of nothing at all. Its banks were green with new growths, berry bushes, acacia saplings, and riotously colorful swaths of wildflowers. Beyond the river, high clouds gathered over the titanic mountains rising on Shurima's western coast, and an ocean of sand stretched to the north and east as far as the eye could see. Dust devils capered over the crests of the dunes and blew curiously regular patterns in the sand, like a grazing sand swimmer in search of insects just below the surface. She lifted a hand to shield her eyes from the sun as it glinted on something golden by the river's edge. It was too bright to see clearly, and whatever was down there was hidden by the swaying branches of a new blooming palm tree. What was it? A wandering skalashi stopping for a drink? Nomads? Shakal bandits? Or maybe it was some ancient treasure washed down from a tomb somewhere high in the mountains. When Kari was in her third summer, her father had found a golden-bladed dagger half buried in the river mud, its grip so large it was almost a sword. No one knew where it had come from, but in the years since then, it had never lost its edge and never tarnished. The weapon of a god warrior, her father always claimed. The old men talked about the mighty god warriors of ancient times, towering hybrids of beasts and man, who once led armies of lost Shurima. Ancient wars were said to have destroyed them, and their remains were sealed away in lost tombs guarded by spells and monsters. Treasure hunters, scavengers, and grave robbers traveled the length and breadth of Shurima's burning sands in search of these riches. The old men said it brought ill luck to hunt the resting places of the dead, but when she had been younger, Kari had always imagined herself as a fearless adventurer, at least until her father told her there were rich hunters and old hunters, but no old and rich ones. She carried on toward the river, passing through a patch of wildflowers with petals of vivid blue and crimson. Clouds of pollen rose up, and she hummed along with the lazy droning of insects as they flitted to and fro. The splashing of the river drew her on, and she took a deep breath, tasting its crisp sharpness and the warm scents of the flowers. Emerging onto a wide patch of earth, beaten flat by the feet of Saikal's water-bearers, Kari took a moment to savor the view, all thoughts of washed-down treasure forgotten at the wondrous sight of the river. The cut was a gorge around 50 feet wide, and when it was dry, around 10 feet deep. The children of Saikal took shade in it when they had time to play, but now there was no shade to be had, for the cut was filled with fast-flowing water that ran like molten silver from its source high in the mountains. The river spumed at its banks and swirled with endless spiraling patterns where it eased past outcroppings of red rock. Dartflies skimmed the water surface, and Kari felt droplets misting on the mahogany skin of her arms. She knelt on the bank and placed the bowl beside her before plunging her arms into the river. After the heat of the day, the icy cold was welcome. Kari scooped the water into her cupped hand and took a long drink, so different to the taste of the cave wells. This must be what kings and gods drink. Once she had slaked her thirst, she dipped the bowl into the water. She grinned and tipped the water over her head, gasping at the biting chill of it. Again, she filled it and poured it over herself, laughing at the sheer extravagance of what would have been unthinkable only a few years ago. "Refreshing, isn't it?" said a deep voice from farther along the riverbank. Kari jumped and almost lost her grip on the bowl. She caught it just before it hit the ground and let out a long breath of relief. Bibi had been so angry when she dropped it last summer and tried to hide her mistake instead of just admitting to it. She looked up in annoyance again, seeing the golden glint between the tall grasses crowding the riverbank. "Who's there?" she demanded. "You almost made me drop Bibi's bowl again. If it broke for good this time, I'd tell her it was your fault, and then you'd be in real trouble." "Apologies, child," said the voice. "I did not mean to startle you." Kari carefully set the bowl down and peered into the undergrowth. "Who are you?" she asked. The rushes parted as a tall figure rose from its crouching position, and Kari felt as if the breath was being squeezed from her chest. Clad from head to foot in golden warplate with a polished gemstone the color of spring sky set at the center of his breastplate, the armored warrior was much taller than anyone she'd ever seen. Much taller than even Kadidu, the metal smiter who everyone agreed was part of Ascended. The warrior's shoulder guards were carved in the form of spread wings from which a tan dust cloak and streamers of gold-edged crimson cloth were hung. She couldn't see his face behind the beaked and winged helmet he wore. but his eyes burned with the pale glow of a rising sun. She knew she ought to be scared of this warrior, for he was clearly dangerous, and she could sense the terrible power lurking beneath his armor. But his manner wasn't threatening, and he hadn't done anything to make her afraid. Only then did Kari notice that his thickly muscled legs were not those of a man, but had the reverse jointed form of a hunting hawk. One hand was wet with river water, and the other held a giant staff with a heavy spear tip atop a haft of brightest gold. "Aren't you hot in all that armor?" she asked. Those sunlit eyes narrowed, and his head cocked to the side as he regarded her quizzically. "I suppose I should be," he said, his voice rich and its accent unfamiliar. "But no, I do not feel the heat as I once did." "Why not?" "The sun priests remade my body," he said. "Their fire wrought my flesh to be stronger and all but invulnerable. It enhanced my being into something even I do not fully understand." "Are you one of the Ascended?" asked Kari. "I've heard about you. Bibi used to tell stories about them. She said you were men once, but you were turned into monsters and killed each other." "We called ourselves God Warriors," he said sadly. "But perhaps monsters is more accurate." Kari glanced across the river as she saw something moving beyond the lushness of the far bank. For a second it had looked like figures moving through the dunes, but when she shielded her eyes they were gone, almost as if they'd sunk into the sand. "In truth, I no longer feel anything as I used to," he said, squatting by the river's edge and letting the water run playfully over his fingers again. "Why are you here?" asked Kari. "Are you looking for a lost tomb?" "A lost tomb?" he asked, almost amused. "No, girl, I do not come here seeking treasure." "My name isn't Girl," she said. "It's Kari, and I'm nearly 9 summers old." "Water and shade to you." "Water and shade to you, too," said Kari. "So if you're not looking for some old tomb, what are you doing here?" The armored figure stared into the river where shards of its broken reflection danced in the water. "Thinking," he said at last. "I sometimes come here to do that too," said Kari. "It's like having the water back makes it easier to think of pleasant things. What were you thinking about?" "Many things," said the armored figure with a heavy sigh, "and none of them pleasant, Kari of Saikal." "Wait, you know Saikal?" He nodded and said, "I do indeed, Kari. I knew it when it was no more than a few crude huts beside the riverbank. I knew it when it grew to a town, and I knew it when I traveled here as a guest." "You must be very old then," said Kari. He laughed. "Yes, I am very old. How is it you do not know me? Great gulfs of time have passed since I last walked my domain, but I am told my name has not been forgotten." "So who are you?" "I am Azir, blessed of the sun, emperor of Shurima." "You're the Hawkfather?" "I am," agreed Azir, and again Kari saw more shapes moving across the river. She sensed movement beneath her and looked down as the sand rippled between her sandaled feet. Looking back up, she saw what might have been the outline of another man through the tall grass, but it faded with a hiss of falling sand as soon as she looked at it. "Is there someone else with you?" asked Kari. "I am an emperor," said Azir. "And emperors seldom travel alone." "Did you really bring your city up from underneath the sands?" "I did, yes, and it cost me greatly." "What does it look like?" "It is a golden city of wonders and magic," said Azir, holding up his hand and letting the water run between his clawed fingers. "Its rise brought the rivers back to Shurima. This tributary flows only because I have made it so." Kari's mother had raised her with manners enough to say, "Thank you. We used to have to rely on cave well water, and it's nasty, all red and cloudy and full of sand. This is much better. I have to get some clean water, you see. My cousin and Hay's having a baby, so Bibi sent me to the river to get clean water." She turned from Azir and scooped up fresh water in the bowl. "Wait, stay a while," said Azir as she turned to go. "I really have to get back," she said. "The baby could come at any moment." "I could command you to stay," said Azir. "Would I have to stay then?" "If your emperor commands it, yes." "Are you my emperor?" Azir crouched and briefly placed a heavy, clawed hand on her shoulder. His skin had a ripe animal reek to it, like a skinned hide just before it was cured. She felt the power of his grip as talons dug into her skin, an awesome strength that could crush stone and bend iron. Despite that, she still felt no threat from him, only a strange sense of loneliness. I am your emperor, he said. Very well, I'll stay then, said Kari. But you have to tell Bibi it's because you told me to. That will not be necessary, he said. You don't know my Bibi, said Kari, looking back up the hillside to the town. Smoke curled from cook fires readying meat for the evening meals, and the sound of livestock vied with the clang of metal from Kadidu's forge. Someone was singing an old water-finding song, and Kari smiled as she thought of the newest addition to her town's family. Tell me, what do you know of Saikal's history? Asked Azir. Do you know how special it is? Special? Really? Said Kari. I don't think so. Not much has ever happened here. Bibi says it's been here centuries, but all the best stories are about things that happen far away. You are wrong about that, said Azir. The best stories are the ones that unfold right in front of us, even if we do not know it at the time. And something of great import took place in this very town, not long after its first grew from the river folk's dwellings. Now Kari was intrigued. Really? What was it? Saikal is where Zerath was born. Who? She said. A flock of hookbills took flight across the river, and Kari scooped up more water from the river to splash in her face. It was getting hotter, and the sun was directly overhead now. Azir looked at her expectantly. That name means nothing to you? He said. She shook her head. Was he a friend of yours? Azir turned to look out over the sands, and she felt the tension rise in him, like the sinew of a bowstring on the verge of snapping. The shapes in the sand shifted again, and Kari saw just how many of them were there. Dozens, at least, probably more. She took an involuntary step back in the shallow water, at last feeling the onset of fear. The claws on Azir's slender fingers arrested her in place once more, biting through her thin tunic. You're hurting me, she said, and he immediately released her. Truly, the name means nothing to you? No, sorry. Azir knelt before her, and a great weight seemed to settle upon him. He swept his staff out across the endless expanse of desolation, to the invisible horizon where killing heat rippled the air, and strange creatures of obsidian lived beneath the sands. All of this, said Azir with great weariness, was his doing. His ambition and his hate drove him to betray me at what was to be my greatest triumph, or at least that was what I told myself. The truth is, it was at that moment of my greatest hubris, my greatest blindness, that he struck. I don't understand what that means, said Kari. No, I suppose you wouldn't, said Azir. Time has changed Shurima beyond all recognition, and wiped away the memory of our triumphs and our defeats. Only legends remain. The people of this new Shurima speak of our lost greatness as stories to tell children, believing it gone forever. Did you know my empire once stretched from ocean to ocean across this entire continent? That golden outposts were built among the jungles of the east. 70 satrapies sent tithes and warriors to the capital, and wealth flowed to its coffers in a river of gold. The Shuriman Empire spoke in 100 languages, with art and music from cultures beyond number. Azir paused, looking up at Saikal. Kari couldn't read the face behind his helmet, but his pale eyes burned with cold fire as he spoke again. But it was an empire built on the bloodied backs of slaves, those our army took in conquest, or who broke the law, or were born to that fate. And ours was an empire that reveled in cruelty. Slaves were denied any names but those we chose to give them. We exploited their skills and rewarded them with suffering. We used their bodies until their flesh gave out, and when we were done with them, we cast them aside. Was Zerath a slave? Azir nodded. Yes, he was taken by the host of Renekton at Neremazeth to the northwest, but this was where he was born. I met him in the great library of my father's capital, and we soon discovered our shared love of history and mathematics. We met in secret, for a member of the royal bloodline could not consort with a slave, poring over the library's many scrolls and books. We grew up together, and after I became emperor, he brought me here, and we lay by this very river to look up at the stars, just as we had when we were children. It doesn't sound like you were cruel, said Kari. It sounds like you were friends. I believed we were, and perhaps even he did for a time. but I was royalty with other slaves, and I was not kind to them until much later. Zarath knew that every moment we were together, I held his life in my hands. On a whim, I could have had him killed, and he knew it. That I would have never thought to do so was irrelevant. He was a slave, and our friendship could never be on an equal footing. What happened to him? Azir laughed, and it sounded bitter and hollow to Kari. As my arrogant dream of becoming emperor came closer to reality, Zarath's ambition swelled, and so too did his ruthlessness. I saw it. I knew. But his plots were paving my way to the throne, so I chose to ignore it. Azir stood and planted his staff in the earth beside him. The sunlight gleamed on his armor, and though he towered over Kari, he suddenly seemed somehow diminished. On the day of my ascension, just as I planned to free Shurima's slaves, he betrayed me. He cast me into the killing fire as he took my place on the sun disk to steal my godhood. I was supposed to ascend that day, but instead Shurima fell and devastation swept over the land. An empire that had ruled the known world for centuries was wiped out in the blink of an eye by a terrible cataclysm that laid waste to the earth and burned away the waters. Is that why Shurima's a desert? Azir nodded. I kind of feel bad for him, said Kari. For Zarath? Yes, I mean, it's bad he betrayed you, but how could he not feel the way he did? He was a slave, and he had to do whatever you said all the time, or else he'd be killed. She felt his anger, but couldn't tell if it was for her or Zarath, or even himself. You speak with a child's understanding, and I have tarried too long with you. It is time to set my hands to purpose here. Kari backed away from the risen emperor, suddenly fearful as he turned his gaze on Saikal. What purpose is that? She cried. What purpose is that? I feel you in the winds, in the water, and upon this earth, said Azir. But Kari knew he wasn't talking to her. Only to a ghost. I stood in the ruins of Vakara, the city of my mother, now a blasted, corpse-choked ruin, and felt your spiteful magic. The age I spent in formless oblivion and the years since my rise have not been spent in vain, my brother. My power grows with every rise of the sun, and as the land awakens, so too am I reborn. But there can be no future while you still live, so I will draw you from your hiding place in the shadows with the fire of the sun. Golden light burst from the blades of his staff, so bright Kari couldn't look at it. Its wrathful heat forced her to take a step backward. She looked across the river as the sand there shifted again, and the shapes she had glimpsed in the depths were finally revealed. Warriors rose from the dunes, tall and broad, armored in the manner of their master, yet rendered entirely of sand. They came in the hundreds, sand spilling from their war plates as they marched, in perfect synchrony that no mortal soldiers could ever hope to match. They carried long lances with blades that glittered with flecks of crystal mixed with the sands of their undulant bodies. Kari felt a terrible, knotted fist of anguish in her gut at the sight of them. She jumped as the earth around her cracked and more of the horrid warriors of sand poured up out of the ground. They carried the stench of the deep earth with them, dry and dusty, like the rotted robes clinging to skeletons, sometimes uncovered by winds over the dunes. They came on in serried ranks of wind-blown sand, moving up the slope toward Saikal with murderous purpose in every stride. These were not warriors who fought to protect their loved ones or defend the weak, but terrible, killing things of magic whose only purpose was to destroy. Kari had heard the old men tell stories of terrible wars in far-off lands, and even as horrible as some of them were, she knew they were fought by people who might know mercy and forgiveness. These blank, soulless warriors knew nothing of such things. What are you doing? Kari demanded. Where are they going? Azir looked down on her as if debating whether to even answer her. I cannot build Shurima anew with the chains of the past still binding me. Zarath must die so I can move forward. I mean to purge him from this land, root and branch, and where better to start than where his poisoned seed first emerged. You're going to destroy my home just because this is where Zarath was born? The Emperor nodded. That is exactly what I'm going to do. He moved past her, heading with slow, deliberate strides toward the path uphill. The knot of fear in Kari's gut uncoiled like a snake, and she gagged at the acrid taste of bile in the back of her throat. She felt it slither through her body as if paralyzing her with its venom. But what did Bibi always say about snakes? Stamp on them hard, right behind the head so its fangs can't bite you. Bibi's words stole away from Kari's fear in a heartbeat and replaced it with an anger that burned the snake in her belly away. She turned to Azir and threw the only thing she had at him. The bowl flew through the air and smashed against the back of his head. The broken pieces landed at his feet in shards of blue and red and gold. Azir spun to face her, and a host of the Sand Warriors did the same, their awful spears lowered to aim at her heart. Entire tribes were wiped out for less, girl. Kari stared, aghast at what she'd done. The broken pieces of the bowl reminded her of how it had been the lie that caused the most hurt to her Bibi, not the fact it had cracked. Looking up from the smashed pottery to his ears, she was struck by a sudden thought. "How did you come back?" she said. He paused, her question surprising him as much as it did her. She didn't know where it had come from, but she knew it was important. The army of sand paused in its advance on Saikal, and her mind raced as she tried to think of how she could stall the Emperor a little longer. "You said Xerath killed you," said Kari. "Pushed you into a fire, yes? So how did you come back? How are you alive now?" At first she thought he wasn't going to answer, that his moment of introspection by the water's edge was over. Then the cold fire in his eyes flickered, and she felt the presence of the man he once had been. "Blood of my blood brought me back," he said at last. "A daughter of the sands many centuries distant. She too was betrayed and left for dead. Her blood soaked the sand of my death and brought me back as a phantom of ash and dust." "But you're more than that now, aren't you? Ash and dust, I mean." "I am ascended." "How? How did you go from dust to this?" You saved her, didn't you? You came back and you saved her somehow." Azir took a step toward her, a golden killer looming over her. "How can you know this?" Kari took a breath, tasting the heat and fury within him, but also the soul that made him befriend a slave boy in a library, the part that still burned with the pain of that friend's betrayal. "Because it's what I would have done. You saw she needed help, so you helped her, didn't you?" Azir nodded slowly. "She was dying, and so I brought her to the Oasis of the Dawn. Its waters were long since dried, but with every step I took toward it, clear water bubbled up from below. I laid her down in the clear waters, and as they washed over her, they restored her to life. And as her eyes opened, the power of the sun lifted me up in its fiery embrace and renewed me. It burned my old form away and remade me into something new, something greater than I could ever have been before." "That's it, don't you see?" "See what?" "You were brought back because you saw someone who was hurt and needed help," said Kari. "I bet if you'd left her to die, you'd still be a ghost haunting the ruins, if you'd be anything at all." Azir looked to his sand warriors who still stood poised to run Kari through with their spears. "I have sacrificed so much," he said as Kari bent to lift one of the broken pieces of the bowl. "You see this?" she said, holding up a bladed shard of pottery. "I broke my Bibi's bowl last summer. I dropped it and cracked a piece off the side. It was her favorite bowl, so I tried to hide what I'd done by gluing it back and hoping no one would notice. But I only ended up making things worse." Kari stood and held the fragment of the bowl out to his ear. "We can't take back the mistakes of the past, but we can learn from them," she said. "Killing my town isn't learning from the past, it's making the same mistakes Xerath did." For long moments, Azir was silent, and she saw the turbulent emotions warring within him, echoed in the tremoring sand warriors around him. His helm rose, and he fixed her with his pale gaze. "You speak with a child's understanding." "You told me that already. But this time I do not mean it as an insult. I mean only that your words are uncluttered with greed, ambition, or thoughts of some grand destiny. You speak with an innocent heart." Azir knelt, and she met the sunlight beneath the metal of his helm without flinching. "You are wise beyond your years, Kari of Saikal." "Does that mean you're going to leave my town alone?" "Yes, Kari, it does." And with a hiss like sand through an hourglass, the army of sand sank back into the dunes. Kari let out a sigh and bit her bottom lip as tears of relief threatened to spill down her cheeks. But she didn't want to cry in front of an emperor, so pressed her chin down into her chest. Azir lifted her head and said, "You have her eyes, you know, blue like sapphires." "Whose eyes?" asked Kari. Azir ignored her question and reached down to lift the broken pieces of Bibi's bowl. He turned the shards of broken clay over in his hands, and Kari Kari's eyes widened as clouds of sand lifted from the ground at Azir's feet. It swirled around the remains of the bowl like a miniature sandstorm as Azir's eyes pulsed with sunlight and curling traces of golden illumination traveled down his arms. The light was swept into the swirling sand, enveloping Azir's hands, and when at last cleared, Kari saw the bowl had been made whole again. Not as it had been, but better, the fragments bound together with snaking veins of gold that shone like the sun itself and glittered. "My gift to you, Kari of Saikal," said Azir, handing her the restored bowl. "In return for the gift you have given me." "What gift?" she asked, but Azir didn't answer. He rose to his full height and set off along the riverbank, heading eastward into the desert once again. She watched him go, taking a series of deep breaths to slow her racing heartbeat. "Thank you," she called after him, but Azir had already passed beyond sight in the tall grasses, and high above her, Kari heard the cry of a newborn. So that was quite the long story, and definitely leads us well into the topic next week, which is going to be Azir, which we got a good taste of there in that story. A lot of background on him, but there's going to be more to come next week. So yeah, the story of Shurima does not end here. So each week it's going to be expanded upon, and we'll figure out more about Shurima as a region, as a civilization, with each character too, as they each take place in different parts of it, different times of the civilization. And like I said, next week we're going to dive into the characters, starting with the Emperor Azir. Thank you all for listening to this point, and like I said earlier, please share the content if you enjoy it, or friends that you think would enjoy it. The more people that listen means more people that suggest changes that can make the content better for everyone. You can find this on YouTube, search for Funky Odor. You can enjoy more of my content on twitch.tv/thatfunkyodor, and you can suggest things for the podcast to me on Twitter, as well as at funkyodorgaming@gmail.com. All of these links will be in the description. Thank you for starting this journey with me again, and I promise to not stop until we tackle every last detail of Runeterra. Love you guys, and I'll be back in 1 week.